Hey everyone, guess who has arrived? Mike Morrice.
Hey Brent, hey everyone. Sorry I'm a bit late this afternoon. Nice to see you all here.
It's great to have you back on the show, Mike Morrice.
Well, yeah, and this has been a really important week for all of our efforts with respect to pushing for the benefit. Happy to take questions. I see Cody and a few others here. I can just start by saying that I know that poverty doesn't take a recess over the summer. And while parliamentarians do, we need to keep pushing in every avenue possible. It is disappointing. I share the disappointment that the bill that you all saw yesterday is the exact same as we had a year ago. The only difference is that it's all of our joint advocacy that is the imperative for it being moved ahead. I wouldn't call it fast-tracked, but the fact that it did get ahead at this point is really as a result of 18,000 people who signed the petition, and I know many of you all helped to share that. It's the 43 senators, the 103 MPs from all parties, the emails that were sent in. But that really starts the process again. Right now we've got to move this through in terms of the legislative process, but then also we need to ensure the benefit is funded. That's what I'm committed to continuing to do, to working with all parliamentarians to get it done. I'd love to hear how some of you are processing what you saw this past week. So happy to take questions and try to make sense of some of the process that we're now in.
Yeah, most definitely, Mike, and I'll move on to the questions. We'll go to Cody. We'll start with you first.
I have 3 statements to say in regards to the whole situation with the Canada disability benefit, and all 3 have to do with everything that I've seen. One, I'm not sure if you've read Benita Zerillo's response to the bill being retabled or not. I'm absolutely disgusted with the fact that absolutely nothing has changed in regards to this legislation. It's been a year. You could have vastly improved it and discussed exactly what kind of framework you want to table. And thirdly, they're just starting consultations on all of this now. And apparently, they've had 1 meeting with the provinces in all this time. So it makes you really wonder, what have they been doing in this past year?
Yeah, my take, Cody, on it is what this comes down to is trust. It's on the governing party to demonstrate that they're worthy of all of our trust, that they are serious about moving ahead. And I share your disappointment. Another MP actually put in the request for information on the consultations that have been had. My understanding is there was more than the one conversation, but whatever the case, and I've heard this from many Canadians with disabilities over the last number of months, is that we don't need to wait for 3 years of study or wait for more consultation, that this legislation can and should move ahead as consultation continues, particularly given that, as you point out, and as the minister said, this is only framework legislation. All of the meaningful decisions are left to regulations and, of course, to negotiations, which are important with the provinces and the territories, but certainly share your disappointment. And I think it's on all of us, again, to keep the pressure on to ensure that they earn that trust and demonstrate that this time they're serious about following through and not just doing the politics like they did last June. The reasons I was so looking forward to this conversation is I feel that my advocacy is strengthened the more I can hear from each of you and really try my best to be amplifying your voices. That's the role of an elected official in our democracy. In terms of consultation, whether it's behind closed doors or not, to me, as I said it last time, and I really appreciate Brent, Neil, and everyone else who helped to organize these, because they're so great for connecting, but make sure you're continuing to connect with your MP and push for a meeting with that person. That's where our democracy is at its best. I want to be careful. I think it is important to build trust in our democracy. It's the only it's not perfect, but it's the best we've got. And so I think it's a two-way street. They're not creating as many consultation opportunities as we'd like. Well, that's where reaching out to an MP and asking for a meeting with them is so important.
Do we need to potentially make a motion with getting signatures again about getting us emergency funding? Because I heard the beginning of the conversation there, Mike, with the rest of the group about how things seem to happen behind closed doors. I'm a strong believer that this group in particularly is being managed more at a privy council level as opposed to anybody else. And I will say the word again, but the poverty reduction strategy and the MAID really puts a bad taste in my mouth when it comes to how they're handling the disabled. And Carla, can do all the great things she can do for all of us, but why isn't she pushing for funding for us? I don't know what happened after when the second reading of the bill is, but do we already start a petition to go around to say, okay, now we need an emergency benefit because this has gone on for 2 years, far too long, 2 years and 2 decades, to be honest. We need emergency funding. And why is Carla and Prime Minister Trudeau not pushing back at the premiers to say, okay, you know what, here's funds transfers specifically for people on disability benefits, raise them above poverty. It would be done because it would all go through the normal channels. I'm not saying stop the new benefit things, but we need emergency funding. There are people that are killing themselves because they can't afford anything and they're giving up hope. It also has to be pushed down to the premiers that it's their responsibility and it's them that's keeping us back in poverty. I don't know how we go about doing this. My only thing is that we raise a motion to say to give us emergency benefit money. We did it for CERB or at the beginning. If we're equal, why weren't we treated as equal? We're always the last person to be funded. And it goes back to the charity bill that was talked about yesterday. I think it's 280 or 24, where, let's change the tax laws for the charities so they can give all this property money to the nonprofits. Won't that be good for the nonprofits? If the nonprofits didn't have to be there, we are funding the nonprofit industry, and we are pawns in this whole thing.
So the first question on the emergency funds, I feel so strongly that is what we need. I can speak again. My number one role here, my accountability is to neighbors of mine in Kitchener, and we need support yesterday. This is life or death for a lot of people in my community, as I know it is for communities across the country. I think it's also really important for me to be honest about what I see as possible in our parliament today. And I don't see the level of collaboration, sense of urgency that we saw with respect to the pandemic. I don't see with respect to addressing poverty as it relates to Canadians with disabilities. I don't see it with respect to the climate crisis as another example. The fact is that Parliament can be difficult on some days. I'll give you an example. Just Wednesday of this past week, I know, Janet, you followed really closely. You would have followed the vote on Bill C-216, which was a very important private member's legislation from Laura Johns, the member for Courtenay Alberni, with respect to addressing the poisoned drug supply and the crisis we're in with respect to the number of Canadians dying as a result of a poisoned drug supply. And as you probably know, it did not have the support required amongst either the Liberal or the Conservative Party. They together joined in not even allowing the bill to go forward to second reading. We had about 14 Liberal MPs who voted against the party. I jumped up in question period and tried to have a kind of a last appeal to the Prime Minister to shift tone on it, and it wasn't successful. And so there are moments of joy and promise in our Parliament, and there are also really challenging moments where I recognize that we don't have the support amongst parliamentarians today. It's why I think we need to continue to push for proportional representation, because I feel like our Parliament would be more progressive if we had a Parliament that better reflected the true views of Canadians across the country and not the distortions we get through first past the post. So when it relates to emergency funding, Absolutely, I'd be willing to support and sponsor a petition for exactly that. If I'm also being realistic, I don't see the current parliamentary support for it, despite the fact that I think it's critical and necessary, and we should all continue to advocate for all three of the items that I mentioned in the previous question as it relates to both funding, the amount, the eligibility, and the speed of emergency funds. But I also want to make sure that I don't set unrealistic expectations to say, okay, let's just go get a petition going and we'll get emergency funds in place before the end of June. Personally, I don't see that amongst my 337 other colleagues in the House. I don't see the support for it that we would need to have that moved through. Which is not to say, but that's everything to say about the continued advocacy that is required, because that's how we get change in our democracy, is by letting our MPs know. So that's, to me, something that I would encourage continued advocacy around, recognizing that there's only so much energy each person can put in towards advocacy, both as it relates to pushing through the Canada Disability Benefit and those that want to push for the emergency funds that are also required. And that's, I figured it's best to answer that with the GLI question from Patricia, because it's kind of a similar story. My honest assessment is, as Parliament stands right now, we will see a very similar result on the GLI private members bill as we saw on the poison drug supply one from just a few days ago. You know, I've been pushing for GLI since long before I was elected this past fall, but we're going to need a lot more voices and support if we're going to get it passed. So that's both my aspiration, but also my realism on where our Parliament currently sits. And I know it's insufficient, and that's why we need to all continue to push for more.
You know, there's 60% of Canadians who want.
You're totally right.
Yeah.
You're totally right. Just like there's 68% who want more climate action. So these are the distortions that our Parliament doesn't fully reflect the views of Canadians. And again, my view on this is because we don't have a system where we don't have a proportional representation of our votes. So we don't have X percent of Canadians' views in the House of Commons. You look at the most recent Ontario election.
Evil Flightless Birdie, I think you had two questions that you were going to try to cram in there.
One from Lucy Hope and one from Joseph, who
okay, if you could really try to get those in really quickly.
Joseph's question is that he didn't see anything in the bill that protected it from clawbacks. In fact, I've seen more in C32 than in C35, and I'm not sure exactly where that goes to, but if you can.
Sure. We need to continue our advocacy on ensuring, it was similar to a kind of a previous question, in terms of the amount. There's nothing, so to be super clear, the current bill C22, I've read it multiple times now, it looks identical to C35, and in both cases, it leaves almost every critical decision to regulations that would follow after it's passed, including the amount, which of course is related to whether there's any clawbacks. This is part of the disappointment that this is like, even the minister, again, she called it framework legislation, as opposed to, if you look at the legislation for the guaranteed income supplement for seniors, there's a lot of specificity. Here's the dollar amount. It's right in the legislation. Even into the coming into force, you'll see the clause about when it comes into force. Many other pieces of legislation will say, you know, after 30 days after it comes into force. In this one, it says it comes into force, I think, like at the discretion of Cabinet. For those of us who are optimists, it means that our advocacy on the amounts, on no clawbacks, on the criteria for eligibility is really continues to be well timed, because it's not set out in the legislation yet. So whether it's through amendments or advocacy that would affect the regulations, we need to keep pushing that there are no clawbacks, that no matter what province or territory someone is, that this is a net benefit across the board to lift up to a livable amount.